Hi, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. We're so excited to have you joining us today. My name is Suzanne Marcus, and I'm from the National Alliance for Safe Housing, and I'm joined by my colleague Debbie Fox from the National Network to End Domestic Violence to welcome you to the Domestic Violence in Housing Technical Assistance Consortium, or otherwise known as DVHTAC's weekly peer support call in our COVID-19 special topic series. DVHTAC, can you advance the slides, please? Really quickly. Sorry. There we go. DVHTAC, I just wanted to show folks that DVHTAC is an exciting consortium of federal partners and national technical assistance providers with deep expertise at the intersection of housing and domestic and sexual violence and human trafficking. And at the end of this presentation, we will share the COVID-related resources and support that DVHTAC has available for folks. Today, we are discussing how safe housing programs are serving families during this stressful time and helping them to build resilience and navigate the impacts and demands of sheltering in place. Joining us to share their resources and strategies are Amy Torsha with the Vermont Network Against Domestic Violence, the Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, and Tien Ung with Futures Without Violence. The peer support call is designed to give advocates a chance to learn more from one another, ask questions, process issues, and provide mutual support on the impact of the COVID-19 virus in our safe housing programs. So please not only enter your questions, but please share strategies that you're using in your programs and community in the chat and communities in the chat box, so that this could be a really truly an exchange of folks like you who are deep in the trenches doing this work. So now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Tien Ung from Futures Without Violence.
Happy and honored to be here today. I really appreciate being invited to sit with this community, and especially to talk about impacts on children and how to build resilience for children. It's not, or it's easy, I think, sometimes to sort of fall prey to powerful counter narratives that children may not either not understand what's going on right now, or perhaps it doesn't impact them. But we know from the science that none of this is true, and in fact, all of these experiences can have really profound impacts on children's health and their development over their life course. So I'm just really grateful to have been invited here today, and I want to just thank our sponsors and the folks who worked really hard to pull this webinar together. I think children and families who are suffering right now during these really scary times will do better when we can find ways to continue to do things like this, to share with each other, to learn from each other, and to innovate together to design new solutions, even though things are really, really stressful. So I'm going to start off a little bit by going over some of what we know about the science of stress and adversity and how it impacts our well-being. I'm sure that many of you on this call are familiar with this body of work, but I think during the current stressors that we're all feeling, it's a really good reminder to say that there's a lot that we know from the work that we've been doing already, and to extrapolate from what we know to help us design innovations during these really unprecedented times. And so the first thing I just want to put before everybody's mind, or to put top of mind for people, is that there are very different types of stress. We know from the science that, yes?
I apologize for interrupting your flow. So you're coming through very soft-spoken over the phone, and some folks are having trouble hearing you. We already have our audio turned all the way up. Could you quite possibly project a little bit more?
No worries. Thank you for stopping me and telling me. Is this better?
Yes, that's better for me anyway. Folks, can you type in the chat?
Okay, so here we go. Thank you so much for telling me. I'm sorry that that you couldn't hear me. I appreciate the prompt. So I just want to sort of put top of mind for folks that not all stress is the same, right? And when it comes to stress and what we know about the science of stress and well-being is that environments and conditions, the context in which we live, matter in huge ways. So as everyone on this call is trying to think about, what are the types of experiences and conditions that we need to design to during this time to really help build resilience and to help our children and families and the people that we serve deal with the current constraints and the stressors that it causes on them. It's important to know that having relationships and ensuring that stress isn't something that is experienced over a chronic or pervasive amount of time goes a long way. And that's what we are referring to when we think about positive and tolerable stress experiences. Those are the experiences where, the conditions and experiences that people feel aren't prolonged and they're not chronic, that they have supports and services and resources in place so that they can shift and change the stressors and the burdens that they are facing, and that those types of dynamics can go a long way in preventing longer term impacts on health and well-being. And then there's the condition of toxic stress, which is what happens when our stress response system is elevated within our bodies for chronic amounts of time, and especially for children in their earliest years without the presence of any supportive relationships or resources that can have a real major impact on their functioning. The other thing that we know, in addition to the fact that stress, not all stress is the same, is that when children and families experience the impact of trauma and adversity, they can experience it in sort of three different sort of domains of functioning. First, they can experience it biologically, as I was just saying, which means that the experience of what's going on around them and outside gets under the skin and negatively impacts their health and their physiological well-being, their cardiovascular health, their immune system, even their pulmonary and metabolic health is impacted by prolonged exposure to stress. But we know that trauma and prolonged adversity also impacts people psychologically. It impacts how we think, feel, act, and learn. And then finally, we know that prolonged activation of our stress response system or exposure to trauma and adversity can impact us socially. It impacts how we relate to ourselves as well as to others around us, and therefore how they then relate back to us. So as you continue to think about the types of safeguards to put in place or the ways in which you serve children and families during these times, it might be helpful to sort of think about how you will reduce sort of negative impacts in these three areas. And then finally, before we get into the science of resilience a little bit and some of the strategies that we've been coaching people around during this time, I wanted to share with you some protective factors that we know from the science and from the literature are particularly useful in buffering the negative impact of trauma as a result of domestic violence for both children and adults. And that is, designing ways in whatever ways that you can to create and make safer and more stable conditions. Sometimes it might not be possible to have absolute safety, but can you do things that make things a little bit safer, a little bit more stable? Incremental sort of efforts to make things safer and more stable count in big ways. Finding ways to make sure that children and families have connections and can maintain connections to friends, family, cultural groups that are important to them, as well as just spiritual communities is also something that's really an active agent in promoting resilience and buffering the negative impacts of domestic violence. And then certainly fostering ways to help parents and children connect and relate to each other, even though things are incredibly restrained and constrained at this time, is something that will go a long way, in addition to promoting opportunities for parents and children to build their social and emotional abilities, and also to practice a growth mindset and to practice resilience. So when we think about resilience, I really want to share with this group that what we know from the science is that resilience is not a trait like, grit or perseverance or hardiness. It's actually a capability that can be built over time and sustained, and that can be cultivated and nurtured and should be cultivated and nurtured. And what we know from the science of resilience is that there are 6 different sort of building blocks of resilience that we can cultivate in practice and policy and program design that will help children and families who live under chronic conditions of adversity and trauma exposure to do well, and to do well in all of those 3 areas that I'd mentioned earlier. And just real briefly, it's, finding ways to help build their emotional intelligence when you're thinking about your programming, your intervention and policies. It's important to also think about energy, which is just sort of basic physical, sleep, nutrition, exercise. Certainly prioritizing and finding ways for people to have and maintain healthy relationships and connections. Helping people gain perspective during trying times is something that really promotes and helps them bounce back from adversity. And in that context, you want to try to find ways to support folks in meaning making, in finding hope, in believing that, out of severe hardship, there can be growth and good things as well. And then finally, really helping people sort of set priorities alongside cultivating positive perspectives, because, when you're really, really stressed, the first thing that can happen is, we lose a sense of focus and of decision making. And it's hard because everything becomes important and everything becomes pressing. And especially for families who are the families that you all are serving, there are lots of strains and constraints and pressures around job loss, mounting bills, housing insecurity, that it can be really hard to know what to tend to first. And so finding ways to help folks get through every day with incremental goal setting and making plans and priority setting is really important. And then that relates to sort of the last piece around building resilience that is important to think about in terms of solution design. And that's finding ways to give people opportunities to experience their own sense of agency, that they can actually make good decisions and move things forward and experience a sense of self-effectiveness. So we were thinking about different questions that might be meaningful to folks on this call. So I'm going to try to take all of the things that I was just sharing and teeing up as part of the background body of science and research that informs our thinking at Futures, to sort of say what might that look like and how would that translate in terms of supporting families in providing structure and routines to children who are being homeschooled. The first thing on here is a website called Wide Open School. It actually is remarkably a pop-up website that was created to help folks access learning and teaching materials that they can provide in a home or shelter setting. It's separated by grade and age group. It also has really wonderful support resources for children with different learning abilities and different educational needs. It's absolutely 100% shovel ready, and also has suggestions about, you know, how to structure a day. We've been telling a lot of folks, aim for a shortened school day, right? Go 2 to 4 hours, not sort of the whole day. And then try to integrate sort of learning into sort of the everyday activities of being at home or in shelter, whether that's, you know, counting and doing math work while a family's preparing a meal, or doing even fun activities like, you know, we've been encouraging people to create big, huge community storyboards where you can put a big sort of poster easel pad on the wall and have different family members write a line in a story to create a joint community story that, you know, will help children and families get some of their learning in without the stress of having to feel like, you know, they have to be teachers and to trigger, you know, the stress that we all feel that can trigger conflict and tension during times like this. And we always like to try to put a little plug in to sort of try to get physical health in there during, you know, the school day for children and families in fun ways. You know, having, you know, a shelter-friendly competition that has to do with having everybody's name on a board and seeing how many, you know, squats, sit-ups, or jumping jacks people might be able to do, you know, in one day. So, and you don't have to do it all at once, but, you know, every once an hour, everybody can sort of do 5 or 10 jumping jacks or throughout the day. So then you can kind of see at the end of the day who got to do what and just celebrate PE. We had a lot of questions about how to support families if a caregiver gets ill. And here we've just been really encouraging folks to be really proactive. So try ahead of time, especially with children and families where domestic violence might be an issue. You know, sit down based on your relationships with family members and try to get a good sense from the survivor who their social network is, who could be alternative caregivers for their children if they get ill. Sort of really do a lot of scenario planning with them in a very empathic, loving way and a reassuring way so that they know and you know and that the child knows that, or the children know that there's, you know, there's a plan in place and everyone's been a part of it. And if it happens and somebody gets ill, that everybody's going to be okay and cared for. We've also been trying to remind people, you know, which I think we all know, that testing positive for COVID-19 can mean a lot of different things, and there's great variance in terms of what type of care is needed and what type of response is needed. And so this is where it's really important to have a very tiered response for those who may test positive and may be asymptomatic, all the way up to, you know, those who test positive and need more acute care. Some of the things that we've been talking with families about have to do with how to address the specific needs of children and families during a pandemic. And a lot of that, you know, has to do with what we've been inviting people to think about, how to do that in a way that promotes, you know, resilience, that taps onto any of those 6 sort of domains or building blocks of resilience that we talked about earlier. Finding ways to get technology donated or access so family and friends can connect with other people who may be important to them during this time. Seeing if you can collaborate with other service providers and other businesses in your area to get things donated for children and families, like toys and puzzles, maybe even hosting you know, game night with proper, obviously, social distancing to do things like play charades or Pictionary, or give families a chance to sort of enjoy one another in closed and tight quarters. And one thing that we've been trying to promote quite a bit is helping shelter staff, helping families to promote mutual aid, right? To figure out how they can help each other, maybe serve as alternative caregivers for their children if people are not well or need more support or care. That speaks to sort of, building agency as a form of resilience while in shelter. We wanted to put a couple of different specific strategies for how to engage youth as well. Children and youth are often used to sort of not having their voices matter as much as adults. And so we've been really trying to get the message out and to promote the idea that as much as possible, it's really great to include youth in any type of scenario planning and in creating safety protocols. We like to remind people that for adolescents also, it's a time of great sort of searching for identity. And so finding ways to really listen and validate their concerns and their fears and give them a chance to participate in any type of planning goes a long way. It might be really hard to get youth and young people and children to sort of comply with self-care and physical distancing. So really try to create a culture where there's a lot of maybe community problem solving, active problem solving with them around, what can we do to help everybody remember to wash their hands. And so, really being proactive and engaging collective problem solving. We love to think about how we can promote emotional intelligence, energy, and cultivate good relationships with young people. And some of the things that we start off with first too is that there's this incredible parallel process because you're serving children and families while you're going through all of this simultaneously as well. So first and foremost, make sure that your programs and your workplace practices have strategies in place to sort of help give a break, take a break, but to help the staff really engage in their own wellness and self-care and resiliency building strategies so that they can be present for shelter staff. We've been highlighting a lot in terms of harm reduction to support youth coping and even adult coping during this time, as opposed to, absolute abstinence, for example, if somebody is struggling with recovery. And one of the things that we've really enjoyed doing is encouraging people to do community life journey maps. You can do that with staff and young people. You can do it with families as a way to sort of help a survivor talk about the story in their lives with their children by identifying hard moments around their lives, but also highlighting from those hard moments, what they've learned from it, how they've overcome it, and what makes them sort of so strong and resilient today. And with that, I'm going to shift things over to my colleague, Amy. There are a handful of resources here that we pulled together that we hope will be helpful to talk about more strategies around how to promote family well-being and to support staff in shelter. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you, Tian. Can everybody hear me? Terrific. This is Amy Torsha. I'm calling in from Vermont. I'm the Children's Advocacy Coordinator here at the Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me. I see that there's lots of other coalition staff on the call. And today, I just wanted to share a few ideas that pretty much support all of what Tian said and just add a couple more thoughts and a little bit, a couple more tools for you all to have in your toolboxes. The first one, just thinking broadly about supporting families during this time. thinking specifically about children and parents who are living in shelters or are precariously housed, or I'm thinking a lot these days about children and families who are at home and worrying about their safety as well. So, we know that parenting can be hard in the best of circumstances. And if you add the stress of worry about being in a shelter or domestic and sexual violence, it just becomes exponentially hard. For kids and families who are in our shelter, some of this new normal is what they've already been living with. Their lives have already been upheaved and they're probably in crisis. Things are unpredictable and temporary. Their foundations have already been rocked. And for those in domestic and sexual violence shelters, there are already limits on their ability to move about in their lives freely because they're fleeing from violence, sometimes with no school and certainly with social isolation. So, this is kind of a lot of what we're used to, just compounded by other stresses. And we also just know that shelters are stressful. So the pandemic adds another layer of fear and worry, and we might be seeing kids and parents whose stress responses have heightened, especially those who've experienced trauma may be hypervigilant. They may be waiting for the next, shoe to drop, less able to calm down, regulate their feelings. And for all of them, they're probably just really big feelings. For children and youth, this can look like acting out more, needing more attention, closeness, regressing into old behaviors, feeling irritable and angry, crying a lot, disorientation, confusion, feeling like they're out of control. And for adults and parents, it's the same thing, but overwhelmed, and add on to that worry about your kids and the safety of your family and money and health. We all have shorter fuses. And for all of us, it's harder to regulate our emotions and calm down. So I'd like to just share a simple framing tool that was created, I think can create some balance for families and also for us as advocates. I adapted this from the Child Trends article and added an extra R. So the 4 R's, reassurance, routine, regulation, and relationships. The concepts are both for you all as advocates as well as for families. You can apply this to your work to support families directly, as well as share these ideas with parents and children in their daily lives. I was talking with my 20-year-old niece a while back when this first thing all started and helping her kind of navigate this new way of being. And I realized after we talked that I had actually covered all 4 of these R's without actually knowing it. I asked her what she'd been hearing on the news and how that was impacting her, share what I knew about how things were being handled here in Vermont and locally to keep us safe, asked her about her daily work and home routine and changes, what was feeling good for her, asked her how she managed her panic and who she was able to count on and stay connected with. So the first R, reassurance. Kids really need to know that adults are managing this and that we're available to talk to them about it. There's so many resources online now about how to talk with children about the pandemic, and they all have commonalities, which are, to ask open-ended questions, to limit exposure to news, to ask kids what they know and then kind of take their lead and ask them how they're feeling about things and just validate all of what they're feeling, using drawings and stories for the littler ones. You can explain that COVID-19 is a virus that can make some people feel very sick, but that there are ways that we can keep ourselves and others safer and to stay healthy, and then give them some powerful tools like, washing your hands and sneezing into your elbow and all of those kinds of things. There's one in particular resource that I just love, which is Sesame Street. Just has a terrific website. It's on my last slide. You can check it out. But recently they did the ABCs of COVID-19 with CNN, and it's like a 4 series. I think they're little, like maybe 20-minute videos, and children are calling, kind of videoing in with their questions. My favorite question was, if I eat soap, will it make the virus go away? And there are just these really awesome doctors and other folks who are answering questions of As shelters, you all can provide all kinds of support to parents, to how to, role play maybe with them about ways to talk with their kids, help them look at some of the resources that are available, and provide some tech for children and youth to be able to stay connected to their family and friends. And I think it's also a time to kind of think about loosening our guidelines and rules in shelters to make sure that people really can get what they need. The second R is routine, and I love what Tian was saying about including joy and fun in your routines. Routines give kids predictable things to count on, even in times of crisis and even in shelters, and it can make them feel safe. So, and I know that homeschooling can be very, very, very stressful for families right now, although the predictability and routine of it may actually provide some safe feelings for kids. So keeping as much of the old routines as you possibly can, like bedtime routines and mealtime and playtimes, creating new routines. I think Sesame Street calls it the for now routines. So you can coach parents to talk to their kids about the routines that they're going to do for now, as that may change. Encourage them to include their kids in the design of these new ways of doing things. Encourage family meetings or at least ways to intentionally talk about their new routines. Being flexible about school routines and somehow balancing the too much with enough to try to help families not have so much stress about it. And I feel like this is very individual for families. Some children are really responding well to having some schoolwork at home, and others are not at all. I spoke with an advocate this week who had a child in the shelter who was just refusing to do any schoolwork at all, and it's taking a lot of persistent support on their part as advocates to to support that child through having to get to do it. And I think it's that persistence and love and care that's going to help that family find their way into this world here. And so as shelters, we can ask families what they need to maintain their routines, like books, food, toys, help them create new routines that are shelter environment friendly, and offer resources for school transitions, like, if you can find some organizations to donate the tech that they need, supplies, tutoring, and helps for parents to manage. I noticed that somebody asked about cabin fever, and I think this fits kind of solidly in routines. I'm not sure how you all are doing with this pandemic, but if I don't have a treat at the end of the week, it's difficult for me to get through the week. So that might be like getting takeout here in Vermont. We can go out and get takeout. Maybe planning a movie week, but you can encourage families to take walks if they can now, or as things lighten up, just be really clear about, well, now you can do this and now you can do that. And in Vermont, soon we'll be able to gather with like 10 or less people outside. So those kinds of things are things to look forward to. But I think having plans about things. The third R is regulate, and everyone can use some extra tools about regulating our emotions, considering how stressful it is. Adults can take the lead by making sure that they're getting the support that they need to regulate their own emotions, and by validating all of the feelings that children and youth are having. Encouraging activities that help with emotional regulation, like exercise and breathing, mindfulness, meditation activities, art, music, and regular playtime. And to support kids to find their own safe spaces in the shelter or wherever it is that they're living. In the corner of a common space is even fine, but helping them to create comfy, cozy spaces. As shelters and advocates, you all can ask parents how they're coping on their own, with their own regulation, and provide materials for all of those art and play and writing and reading activities. There's another great resource on my last slide called A Window Between Worlds. An organization in California, and they have kind of self-led art activities that they've uploaded for people to use during this time, and they're really, really wonderful, and they're really something that children and adults can all do together. And then the final R is relationships, and I just wonder how many of you are now in better touch with your family and friends and are Zooming, with people that you haven't seen in years and years. And it's because we have to stay together during times my perspective, it takes priority over school and work and everything else that's going on. Connection supports resilience and helps people to heal from trauma. So at shelters, you all can support connections between parents and children by talking about it and strategizing with parents and children about that and creating space for it. Offer individual emotional support for parents and kids, because individual is good right now, because sometimes people really need some space from one another. We're all living in very close quarters. Children's advocates in Vermont here have done some really creative things. They have created youth-focused Facebook pages where they're posting positive messages and also can get private messages from youth to advocates. There's one advocate who's using an app called Marco Polo to exchange videos with little kids or with kids who aren't up for texting, really. There's another advocate who's created videos that she just sends to kids regularly with stories and activities and meditation. Some advocates are sending things to kids in the mail, connecting on Zoom or other platforms. And for the families that are at homes and we're worried about, you know, there's all kinds of discussions about the safe ways to staying in contact. But I guess the message is that we do our best to stay in touch if we can, come up with some creative ways to be in touch. So some chat lines are opening at organizations that didn't have them before. If you are communicating with people, suggest using headphones so that and the chat boxes so that they don't have to talk out loud and others can't hear. Other advocates have talked with I talked about folks sitting in their cars and having conversations with them. Also here in Vermont, there's schools are sending lunches home to students every single day. And so some of our programs have put together flyers with universal messaging about self-care and emotional regulation and have their hotlines on the bottom with language like if you're feeling unsafe. Just really quickly in Vermont, the DV shelters are working with individual families to plan for situations similar to what Tien was talking about, to talk about and plan for if a parent or a child becomes ill. And each family plan looks really different depending on the ages and the stages of kids and the needs of the family. And the role of the shelter worker is to support whatever plan they come up with. It usually involves identifying emergency contacts and family members who can take kids and sometimes pets. What would happen if a parent had to isolate in shelter? Sometimes other residents would be able to watch their kids. Perhaps if children have to isolate in shelter because they're ill, what that might look like, what it could look like if families needed to move and it felt like the better plan to move to a hotel. And then if they were at a hotel, how the staff would stay connected to them. And as Tien mentioned, I think it's super important to include kids in creating these plans, or at least understanding these plans, because it will help them feel safe because they're worried as well. Also, quickly in Vermont, shelters have been advised to move people into motels if they're hyper-vulnerable, so over the age of 60 or have medical conditions. Shelters have also been advised not to bring new people into shelter, and we're still kind of doing that. So we're not bringing new people into shelter, but we do have motels and hotels that are state funded for them to go to that are unlimited until things lift here. And then finally, there is a congregate recovery sites for people who are experiencing homelessness or who have mild symptoms of COVID. And isolation sites are for people who've been directed to self-quarantine but do not have a COVID diagnosis. And then finally, these are just some resources that I would like to share before things open up for questions. The first is the Child Trends article that I mentioned before about it's focused very much on children's well-being. Sesame Street site that I mentioned as well. On their Sesame Street in community pages, there's videos and principles and all kinds of articles, and they focus on health routine and emotional support. And the CNN Sesame Street Town Hall, you would just have to search for that one. Just for Kids is a comic book story. For older kids, it's very cool. And then Futures, as Tien mentioned, has a really good website, really good resource for families. And then the Vermont Network also has a ethical adult campaign that we've recently rolled out that has all kinds of tools for staying in good connection. Okay, well, I am done, and I'm going to hand it on over to the organizers. Thank you all very, very much for letting me be with you today.
Thank you so much, Amy. I hope everyone can hear me. If not, let me know in the chat box if I need to speak up. Thank you, Amy and Tam, for your excellent presentation and centering the needs of children and families, and really offering us some great information and ideas that are useful for families and all the children and the families that we work with, but also as advocates in the field, just things that we can also be doing to care for our emotional well-being and resiliency, and also with our families as well. So we have, just want to make a note that we have consortium resources that we've compiled as the DV Housing Technical Assistance Consortium. So we're, like all of us, are getting a lot of information, so we're trying to compile it and have it all in one place. So I'm sorry, I'm looking at the chat box. Someone says they hear two people talking over each other. I hope it's clear now. Okay, so we have a whole list of consortium resources that are related to the intersection of domestic and sexual violence and housing. So we encourage you to visit the Safe Housing Partnerships website, and then that's the umbrella website for all the technical assistance partners that are part of the consortium. So there's NASH, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, which is where I work, and then there's the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and Collaborative Solutions, which is our HUD tape provider as well. So we encourage you to go to those websites, and we want to take some time to answer. There was a few questions that were in the chat box, and so I want to open it up for Tian and Amy to answer them. So just a few thoughts. One of our attendees wants just curious thoughts around programs are dealing, how programs are dealing with quarantine issues. This is coming up a lot as people are leaving and coming back to shelter. As we know, there's a lot of essential workers and a lot of women in our programs, and a high percentage of women of color also are working in essential jobs. So it's very critical that we have supports in place for people to come and go from shelter and housing programs so they can continue working and having their jobs and their economic security during this time. So there's a question, just some of the suggestions, if you have any suggestions, Amy or Tian, about what to do for sheltering in place or quarantining when we have families or survivors that need to come to work or run an errand or, you know, pick up things for their family. And then, of course, people are having anxiety around this because it's a shared housing space. So any thoughts on that you want to add? I know we did before I open it back up to the presenters, we did do a webinar last week that was specifically around thinking about different models and shifting models. Actually, it's 2 weeks ago, sorry, with Iowa. So we have talked and heard from a lot of our programs that have shifted to moving a survivor that's having the need to leave and come back, having a private dwelling for them to stay in during this time. It's a solution, or shifting programs to hotel and motel situation. So Amy and Tan, do you have anything you'd like to add or any thoughts on that?
This is Amy. I can just, I guess, I feel like every program across the country is going to have such different resources. I mentioned in Vermont that there are available hotels and motels, and I would imagine that our shelters here are utilizing those for these situations. Seems though no matter what the situation is and what model it is that you're able to access, that you have kind of clear bottom line organizational boundaries about, like what your bottom line safety policies, I guess, would be based on what your state's orders are. But then after that, you know, making sure that you're talking one-on-one with the families, with the adults there who are having to go back and forth especially if it has to do with work, I guess, but even for food and all of that other stuff. And then if there's anxiety in the household, I would say that those are conversations that households could have together, where you lay out what the bottom lines of the organization are and also the bottom line needs of separate families, and just, work through it until people can feel safe, or come up with solutions or strategies that feel safe for them.
Amy, can you repeat that last part if you can hear us?
Let's see. Yes, I think I was just saying that. Here, let me look. Yeah, I feel like my last point was just that you would be able to have conversations with all of the folks that are living together in a particular household, so that they could, kind of get on the same page and do some strategizing together. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, yeah, that was clear.
Okay. Yeah, that was my last point, I think.
Dan, do you have anything to add to that question or that sort of thought? All right, I'm going to go ahead and go to the next question then. I think this was covered in some of the presentation pieces, but if there's anything that you have to add, there's a question is how programs combating restlessness and cabin fever in a trauma-informed manner as the pandemic prolongs and continues. So I think there were some great suggestions of the resiliency around creating goals even when we are doing social distancing and sheltering in place, that we are thinking about, yeah, if there's as programs, if there's things that you can mark the days of the week by, have activities, or like I think it was mentioned, like at the end of the week, some sort of reward. So if there is money in a budget, like I know I do takeout on Saturday night. So that's like one example. So like if there's a way you could do like takeout or food for folks in your program, or just somehow breaking up the time that there is a socially distant game that could be played. And I've heard of some programs doing. I'm doing Zumba with my Zumba group. So like if there's a dance related party or something that you could do virtually, just trying to break up the week with activities, I think helps. Is there anything else that you would recommend, Amy or Tien?
I think I'm just gonna, this is Amy again, I think I'm just gonna say to be as creative as you possibly can, knowing that everybody that you're working with is going to be in different states. Some folks are really feeling depressed and saddened by this whole thing, and it might be hard for them to come up with ideas of ways to, to lighten the load for their children and also for themselves. So, your advocates have special superpowers to do this kind of thing, and I would say that as think about what's working for you and transfer that a little bit into how you're supporting families, and ask them the kinds of questions that would get them to start thinking about what would actually make them feel a little bit better weekly, every day, maybe something that they could do every day, and then something that they could look forward to on the weekends. And then households that are living together in shelters as well, depending on how they're able to, how they're kind of sectioned off, or if they're able to live together in one kind of communal situation. There's things that households can think about doing together as well. I love the idea of doing, outdoor games, or doing some social distance kind of, togetherness.
So there's another question I don't think we answered as well in the chat box. It's how were programs dealing with the quarantine issue prior to transition into their shelter, especially if a client leaves briefly but wants to return? I'm not quite sure I completely understand the question. Do you have any thoughts on that, Amy? I'm not fully grasping it.
Oh, I think it seems like it might be about quarantining. So in Vermont, I know that people have been needing to quarantine for 14 days before, if they've come from another place, especially from out of state. So maybe this is like, how do you ask families to quarantine before coming into shelter? And then if they leave and then want to come back. So again, I feel like those are bottom line kind of shelter policies that your organization would want to kind of have a bottom line around, and then be super creative about how you strategize with people about that. Some organizations may need to say, we need you to be in a safe other place for 14 days before you could actually come into the shelter. And then if they leave, they may just have to go through that again, depending on how many people who you have in shelter and what your policies are. So again, it seems like conversations that staff need to have to kind of lay out some kind of policy that everybody's comfortable with, and then be able to articulate that in a caring way to the families that you're working with.
Thank you. That's super helpful. Yeah, and I would add, if there's just the creativity around, if there is someone that might need to leave for a whole host of issues but would want to come back, I just think if there's a possibility to talk to your different funders, and see if there's flexibility. So we've worked really hard at the federal level to create some expansions, or think about things like the Family Violence Prevention Services Act that funds a lot of domestic violence shelters, to think broadly about housing, what housing looks like, and being able to fund alternative housing, whether that's hotels or Airbnbs, and having someone stay in a place if they do need to quarantine. There's a lot of programs across the country that use VILCA funds for housing and have a lot of luck using those funds flexibly. There's also the HUD Emergency Solution Grants money that's coming down to the states, and a lot of that money has been used to move folks out of communal shelters and put people into private dwellings. So I think there's also an opportunity to look at shifting models and talking to your grant administrators about those shifts, so you can come up with creative solutions that could reduce stress and increase health and well-being in terms of decreasing the spread of COVID among folks who are experiencing homelessness and living in emergency shelters. I don't see any more questions unless I'm missing anything. We do have a few more minutes. We have about 5 or 6 more minutes. If people want to jump in the chat box, if you have any other things that you would like to ask, we can answer them. Now I'm getting a little feedback. Sorry about that. Also, if our presenters, if Amy or Tien have anything to add. Yeah, a couple other things to think about is definitely this goes back to addressing anxiety and doing the cabin fever thing, but also thinking about different solutions around alternative housing. But a lot of the mutual aid work and the creativity that's happening is a lot of programs are working with local faith communities and using their buildings that are not being utilized right now. But also you can think about in terms of faith supports for survivors, in terms of some of the anxiety or support that they might be, also different layers of getting support from their faith communities. And also thinking about partnering with health department folks and thinking about different designs and solutions to address COVID during this time. And I think we can move to the next slide. We have a survey. Yes. So if people could take this link, we also just really would love to hear from you all in the field to see what your needs are. This informs our work, our policy work at the federal level when we're asking for additional resources and making the case. It really helps us to have stories from the field and to know what's happening on the ground. So it's about 5 minutes, not that many questions. If you have some time in your day, it would be really great if you could answer those questions. while you're thinking about it right after this webinar. And we have a few more minutes. Are there any other questions? We will definitely be sending out the slides and the recording, and we encourage you to, share it with your colleagues and your coworkers and pass it along. And I think we have a couple more minutes. Oh, Tien's back in the presenter chat. So if Tien or Amy, if you have any closing thoughts, I'll pass it back to you as our presenters.
This is Amy. I'm not sure if Tien is back online, but I guess I just want to thank you all for the very incredible hard work that you're doing to hold survivors right now, and today in particular thinking about children and youth and families in the context of sheltering and safe housing. So I just appreciate you all, and I know that this is just one of the weirdest, toughest times that we've ever had to do our work, but we're learning new things every day, and we're building skills that we never had. And I truly believe that the new normal will be something much better than the normal we had before. So I appreciate you all.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. And Tien, this is Suzanne from NASH, and I would just add one of the things that we're seeing from the field is that these creative advocates that you mentioned are coming up with strategies that I think are that will carry on when COVID hopefully is long gone, strategies that are helping to build deeper connections with the survivors that we work with. So anyways, thank you everybody for your participation and your great questions, and to Amy and Tien for your expertise. So I want to do one last plug for the survey and also for our Safe Housing Partnerships website, which you will find a wealth of information and more information about our ongoing COVID series that we're doing every week on special topics. You can always request technical assistance through that survey as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out. So thank you everybody for your participation, and stay in touch.